If you stand on the cliffs of western Alaska at midnight in midsummer, when the sun refuses to set and the horizon glows like molten gold, you might feel something ancient stirring beneath the wind. For thousands of years, this land lay far from the maps of Europe, far from the ambitions of kings and presidents, far from the dreams of sailors and explorers. Yet Alaska, vast, frozen, dangerous, magnificent, would one day become the most unlikely prize in a global chessboard that stretched from Siberia to Washington, from fur-trading frontiers to imperial politics. But long before anyone called it Alaska, it was a world unto itself.
Before the Russians came with their iron, before the Americans came with their flags, before traders came with rum and rifles, before maps gave names to rivers older than civilization, there were the people of the first ice. The land bridge, known today as Beringia, was not a myth. It was a real place, a wide and windy plain stretching hundreds of miles between Asia and North America during the last ice age. Mammoths roamed it, saber-tooths stalked its edges, and humans, wrapped in fur and courage, crossed it step by step as the world froze behind them and a new world opened ahead. They moved into the valleys that would become Yukon. They settled along the coastlines that would one day be covered by glaciers. They built stories from the northern lights and carved memories into bone and ivory. These first Alaskans, ancestors of the Inupiat, Yupik, Aleut, Tlingit, Haida, Eyak, and Athabascan peoples, were scientists and navigators long before anyone used those words. They understood the movement of whales through frozen channels, the migration of caribou across tundra, the rhythm of rivers breaking free in spring. They lived here for thousands of years, unaware that one day strangers would appear from the sea, bringing religion, disease, metal, maps, and eventually war. But that time would come, and when it did, it began with a single mistake of navigation: the arrival of Russia's shadow. In the early 1700s, the Russian Empire stretched like a sleeping giant across the Eurasian continent. Tsar Peter the Great demanded expansion, eastward, outward, upward. He wanted to know what lay beyond Siberia, beyond the wild Kamchatka Peninsula, beyond the line where the sea met the sky. So he sent a Danish explorer in Russian service, Vitus Bering. Bering did not know he would give his name to a sea, a strait, and a chapter of history. He simply knew the Tsar's command: sail east and find America. The first Kamchatka expedition crawled like a wounded bear through Russia's harshest wilderness. It took years just to reach the Pacific. Men froze to death, horses starved, and officials pocketed money that should have been spent on food and timber. But Bering was relentless. When he finally sailed in 1728, he crossed the strait that later bore his name, but fog kept the American coast hidden. He returned to Russia uncertain whether he had found a new continent or wasted the Tsar's fortune. But the Tsar, long dead by the time Bering returned, had set a machine in motion. A second expedition was launched, larger, costlier, more ambitious. This time, Bering reached Alaska. Storms smashed his ship, scurvy killed his men. Bering himself died on a lonely island in the middle of the Pacific, buried in sand by sailors too weak to dig deeper. But before they died, they saw it. Alaska. A raw, magnificent, terrifying wilderness. They didn't know what it truly was. They didn't know how big, but they knew what mattered most. Its animals wore fur so thick, so luxurious, that it could make a poor man rich and a rich man richer. That was enough. The empires come for the fur. News traveled quickly through the Russian frontier. Islands full of sea otters, hundreds of thousands of them, swam off the coast of Alaska. Their pelts were more precious than gold in China's markets. Russian promyshlenki, frontier fur hunters, were hardened men who carried muskets and preyed rarely. They sailed east in crude wooden ships, crossing deadly waters in search of fortune. Many never returned. Those who did brought back mountains of pelts. The Russians established trading posts on the Aleutian Islands. They forced the Aleuts to hunt otters for them, often taking hostages to guarantee obedience. As the years passed, conflict grew. The Aleuts rebelled, Russian ships burned, violence became the language of the frontier. Yet the empire pushed on. By the late 1700s, Russia had carved its presence deep into Alaska. They built Kodiak as an early base, then stretched south into lands controlled by powerful Tlingit warriors. Charles III of Spain heard rumors of Russian settlements creeping toward California. The British, too, noticed Russia's growing appetite. The Pacific Northwest suddenly became a dangerous game of imperial rivalry. But no one understood Alaska quite like one man: Alexander Baranov. Baranov, the Iron Governor of the North. Baranov was not a noble, he was not a military commander, he was a merchant with a stubborn will and a ruthless mind. When he took control of the Russian-American company's operations in Alaska, he became the de facto ruler of a territory larger than Western Europe. He built Sitka, the Russian capital of America. He fought bitter wars with the Tlingit, who resisted foreign intrusion fiercely and courageously. Baranov survived ambushes, storms, shipwrecks, starvation, and betrayal. He demanded obedience from everyone under his command and enforced his rule with an iron hand. Under Baranov, Alaska became a fur empire. But it was an empire built on fragile foundations. The land was unforgiving. Supply ships arrived rarely. Winter killed as often as war. The Russian Empire, stretched thin across continents, struggled to support its distant colony. Meanwhile, sea otter populations plummeted. The fur that had lured Russia across an ocean was disappearing. And as the 19th century dawned, another country watched from the south with growing interest: the United States. America notices Alaska. At first, the United States barely paid attention to Alaska. It was cold, remote, and occupied by Russia, three qualities that made early American politicians shrug. But American traders saw opportunity. New England whale ships roamed the Pacific. Yankee merchants began to trade with the Tlingit and Aleut, undercutting Russian prices. Slowly, American influence seeped into the region like water through ice. Then something changed. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, nearly bankrupted Russia. The empire realized it could not defend Alaska if Britain attacked it from nearby Canada. The colony was costing more than it produced. Maintaining it meant bleeding money, ships, and soldiers. Russia needed a solution. America needed land. Both countries needed each other. But the deal that followed would become one of the most ridiculed and later one of the most celebrated in world history. The purchase that shocked the world. It began with quiet conversations, diplomats whispering behind gold-trimmed doors, letters exchanged in careful secrecy, maps unrolled on tables in Washington and St. Petersburg, and at the center of it all was one man, William H. Seward, the U.S. Secretary of State. Seward was a visionary in an era where vision was often mocked. He believed the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific and beyond. He saw Alaska not as a frozen wasteland, but as a future powerhouse. Negotiations began. They dragged on. Civil war erupted in the U.S. Deals stalled. Time passed. Finally, on a cold March night in 1767, the Russian minister Edward de Stokel arrived at Seward's house. With lamplight, maps, and whiskey on the table, they reached an agreement. $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre, a territory twice the size of Texas, signed quietly at 4 a.m. When the news reached Congress, politicians laughed. Newspapers mocked it as Seward's folly. Cartoonists drew pictures of Seward buying icebergs. But the treaty passed. On October 18, 1867, in Sitka, Russia lowered her flag while American soldiers raised theirs. A new chapter had begun. A chapter far stranger, darker, and more astonishing than anything either nation imagined.
The air in Sitka trembled with silence on the morning of October 18, 1867. The sky was a low ceiling of gray, and the sea rolled restlessly against the wooden piers. Russian soldiers, stiff in their blue and gold uniforms, stood beside U.S. Army infantry wearing worn Civil War coats. The two groups did not speak. The Tlingit people watched from a distance, quiet, watchful, and deeply aware that the ceremony unfolding was not theirs. They had not been consulted. Their homeland was changing hands between two foreign powers as casually as a merchant trades cloth. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the Russian flag was lowered. It snagged on the pole, refusing to come down, a final show of defiance from an empire unwilling to bow to history. Sailors climbed the pole and tore it free. Moments later, as a bugle sounded, the American flag rose. It flapped wildly in the cold wind, as if unsure whether it wanted to be there. There were no loud cheers, no celebrations, just a strange, heavy uncertainty. The United States had acquired a land it did not yet understand, a land filled with secrets, dangers, and unimaginable riches buried beneath ice. A territory nobody was ready for. For most Americans, Alaska was still nothing more than Seward's folly. Newspapers ridiculed the purchase. Why buy a glacier? What will we do with polar bears and icebergs? $7 million for a land nobody wants? Few realized that Alaska was not empty. It was alive. The Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, Yupik, Inupiat, Aleut, and Athabascan peoples all had systems of trade, governance, art, and culture thriving long before Americans discovered the territory existed. Alaska was a mosaic of civilizations. But the men sent to govern this new land had little understanding of this world. The U.S. Army initially administered the region, but they were unprepared. Officers complained about the cold. Soldiers mutinied for better food. Many deserted their posts altogether. One officer wrote, "Alaska is a land where the world ends, where men vanish, and where time itself freezes." They were wrong, of course. Alaska was not frozen time. It was a clock ticking toward dramatic transformation. The first American explorers, hunters, dreamers, and desperados. American traders arrived first, rugged men with calloused hands and dangerous ambitions. They came for fur, yet not the otters Russia had stripped nearly to extinction, but the remaining fox, beaver, wolf, and marten. Small settlements sprang up along the coast, shacks of driftwood, whiskey-filled saloons, the occasional church. Some Americans married into Tlingit and Aleut families. Others brought trouble, drunken fights, theft, violence. Without a strong legal system, Alaska became a frontier of raw survival. Then came the missionaries. They brought schools, churches, and medicine, along with tools to erase indigenous languages and traditions. Children were punished for speaking their native tongues. Stories whispered for thousands of years were replaced by lessons from foreign books. The collision of cultures was swift, painful, and permanent. Yet even in this chaos, Alaska remained quiet on the world stage, until a discovery that would shake the North. Gold. The boom that turned the ice into fire. It began in the Yukon River drainage, an enormous artery of water slicing through Alaska's wilderness. Traders whispered rumors, flakes of yellow metal shining beneath the sand. Then, in 1880, prospectors Joe Juneau and Richard Harris struck gold near what is now Juneau. The discovery sparked a frenzy. Thousands of hopeful men poured into the territory, bearded prospectors carrying pickaxes and dreams. But nothing compared to what came next. 1896, the Klondike Gold Rush. A shout echoed across North America. "Gold in the Klondike!" The news hit the United States like lightning. Within months, over 100,000 people attempted the journey north. They traveled by steamship to Skagway or Daya, then were forced to climb the deadly Chilkoot Pass, a staircase of ice so steep and brutal it became legendary. One photograph survives, hundreds of tiny figures climbing a line of snow that rises like a white wall into the clouds. That line became known as the Golden Staircase. Some froze, some starved, some fell into crevasses and vanished forever. But those who survived reached the gold fields and tore open the earth. The gold rush did more than fill pockets. It brought Alaska into America's imagination. Suddenly, the nation saw Alaska not as an icy wasteland, but as a land of promise, wealth, and heroism. Newspapers printed stories of frostbitten adventurers and millionaires made overnight. Cities like Nome, Fairbanks, and Skagway exploded with people. Gambling halls clattered with dice. Saloons spilled music and gunshots into the streets. Everything was for sale: whiskey, tools, maps, dreams. Yet for every prospector who struck it rich, 1,000 found nothing. Many died nameless, buried in snow with their hopes. But America's hunger for expansion had been awakened, and Alaska's future was no longer uncertain. A territory taking shape. The United States finally realized it needed real governance in Alaska. In 1884, Congress passed the first Organic Act, giving Alaska a civil government. Judges, marshals, and school teachers arrived, but they were vastly outnumbered by miners, traders, and adventurers. Native communities continued to fight for land, rights, and survival. Despite cultural suppression, Alaska Native people built new forms of leadership, establishing councils, schools, and trade organizations that would later fuel major civil rights movements. Meanwhile, the world outside Alaska was changing fast. New technologies arrived: steamships, telegraphs, and radios. But nothing would connect Alaska to the rest of the world more dramatically than the arrival of the modern age of war. The rise of strategic importance. By the early 1900s, military planners realized Alaska was not just a frontier, it was a shield, a forward edge of America facing Russia, a northern gateway to the Pacific, a land that could determine the balance of power in a world racing toward conflict. In 1912, Alaska was declared an official U.S. territory, but it still struggled for recognition. Its population was scattered, its roads few, its economy dependent on mining, fishing, and fur. Yet deep beneath the mountains and ice, new riches waited: oil, coal, copper, and minerals that one day would reshape global politics. But before that transformation came a storm like nothing Alaska had ever seen. A war that would reach its shores. A war that would test its people. A war that would prove Alaska was not the end of the world, but the front line of it. The world at war. In 1942, the world trembled beneath the weight of the Second World War. Europe was burning. Asia was in chains. Oceans roared with submarines and carriers. America fought across vast fronts, but few imagined the war would ever touch Alaska, the cold, distant frontier at the top of the map. Yet war has no respect for distance. It was June 3, 1942. The people of Dutch Harbor, a remote naval outpost on the Aleutian chain, awoke to the scream of engines tearing through the fog. From the gray sky descended Japanese bombers, the same imperial force that had struck Pearl Harbor just months earlier. Alaska was under attack. Bombs exploded along the shoreline. Oil tanks burst into towering fireballs. Planes burned on runways. Sailors fired back with shaking hands. The world that had once mocked Seward's icebox suddenly realized that the northern frontier was no quiet wilderness. It was a battlefield. The next shock came like a cold knife. Japan seized the islands of Attu and Kiska, the first foreign occupation of American soil since the War of 1812. America was stunned. Newspapers blared, "Enemy on American land. Battle in the north. Alaska is strategic frontier." Suddenly, the United States poured resources into Alaska. Airfields were carved from permafrost, highways sliced through ancient forests, military bases rose from tundra like metal fortresses. The quiet land was no longer quiet. The battle for the Aleutians. The campaign to retake Attu and Kiska was brutal beyond imagination. The Aleutian Islands were a world of fog, icy wind, and mountains sharper than broken glass. Soldiers fought not only the enemy, but the land itself. Men froze in their tents, planes vanished into fog, ships disappeared into angry seas. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes faster than bullets did. On Attu, American forces stormed the beaches in May 1943. The Japanese defenders fought with fierce determination. The battle ended in a massive banzai charge, the largest on U.S. soil, where hundreds of Japanese soldiers attacked with bayonets, screaming through the snow. It was chaos, terror, and tragedy. The Americans won, but at a terrible cost. When they finally stormed Kiska months later, they found the island empty. The Japanese had slipped away under cover of fog. But the mines, booby traps, and harsh weather killed nearly as many soldiers as open battle had. For the soldiers who survived, Alaska would forever remain a place where war felt as cold as the wind itself. Yet in the ashes of war, something new was born. Alaska was no longer forgotten. It was strategic, necessary, alive in the imagination of a nation. And after the war, America turned to a new question. Should Alaska become a state? The long road to statehood. After World War II, Alaska hummed with activity. Veterans stayed, new families arrived, towns grew, airfields became hubs of commerce. The military built radar stations across the Arctic to detect Soviet missiles, a chilling reminder that Alaska now stood at the front line of the Cold War. But despite its importance, Alaska was still a territory, without full rights, without full representation. Alaskans grew restless. Native leaders and settlers alike demanded statehood, but Congress hesitated. Some politicians still thought Alaska was too cold, too far, too empty. Others feared its strategic importance meant giving too much control to a small population. Meanwhile, the people of Alaska organized rallies, wrote petitions, and marched for the right to be Americans in full. One man embodied the movement, Ernest Gruening, often called the father of Alaska statehood. He traveled across the nation arguing that Alaska had more potential than anyone realized. It took years, years of speeches, years of debates, years of proving that Alaska was not a frozen mistake, but a frontier of promise. Finally, in 1958, Congress voted. The Senate erupted in applause. Alaska was approved as the 49th state. On January 3, 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the proclamation. Fireworks lit the winter sky over Anchorage. Villages across the tundra beat drums and sang. The statehood flag was raised. Alaska was no longer a shadow on the map. It was a star on the flag. Oil, earthquake, and the making of modern Alaska. Alaska's new era began with a whisper from deep underground. 1964, the Great Alaska Earthquake. On Good Friday, the earth ruptured. A quake, the second largest ever recorded, struck with unimaginable force. Streets split open, buildings fell like sandcastles, shorelines dropped by entire stories, waves crashed into coastal towns. But Alaskans rebuilt with determination that stunned the nation. And during this rebuilding, the land revealed a secret. 1968. Oil in Prudhoe Bay. Geologists struck oil, vast reservoirs beneath the frozen North Slope. Oil that could power cities. Oil that could reshape economies. Oil that could make Alaska one of the wealthiest places per capita in America. Thus began the age of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, a steel ribbon stretching 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. Workers came from every state, engineers, welders, dreamers. They battled snowstorms, avalanches, polar bears, and political opposition to build one of the greatest engineering miracles in American history. By the 1970s, oil money flooded Alaska. New towns grew, airports expanded, schools flourished. In 1982, Alaska created the Permanent Fund, giving every resident a yearly dividend from oil revenue, an idea unprecedented in America. Yet oil brought conflict, too. Environmentalists warned of spills and habitat destruction. Indigenous communities fought for land rights. The Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989 proved the warnings were real. Alaska watched in horror as black crude spread across its pristine waters. The story of Alaska became a struggle between growth and protection, development and tradition, profit and preservation. But through all of it, Alaska remained uniquely, defiantly itself. The modern northern frontier. Today, Alaska stands as one of the most extraordinary places in the world, a land where grizzly bears roam mountains older than time, a land where native cultures endure with pride and strength, a land where the northern lights dance like spirits across the dark winter sky, a land that still guards America's northern edge, watching Russia across the Bering Sea. Its cities, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, pulse with life. Its villages keep ancient traditions alive. Its wilderness remains vast, humbling, untouched. Alaska is more than ice, more than history, more than a purchase in the dead of night. It is a story of resilience, conflict, ambition, and survival. A story shaped by empires, by wars, by gold, by oil, by the people who called it home long before a flag ever rose over Sitka. It is the last frontier, the edge of the world, a place where history whispers in every glacier and every wave. And though the Russians once owned it, though Americans once mocked it, Alaska proved itself in the end, a land too powerful to ignore, too beautiful to forget, and too wild to ever truly conquer.